What's up, guys? So it's time for the next video on nutrition and diet. So in the first two videos I covered the general aspects and ideas of how to structure your diet in terms of caloric intake and macronutrient breakdown. Obviously that's the most important thing. If your calories aren't on track, first and foremost calories, if they're not on track, then you're not going to make progress. And after that, after you set up your caloric intake, then it's kind of looking at your macro breakdown, proteins, carbs, and fats. If you don't already know what macros are, that's what they are. But after you kind of establish your caloric intake and get your macro breakdown dialed in, then you want to start looking at where your food's coming from, the sources of your food. So that's going to be kind of the topic of this video. Now, some people might say food sources don't matter. Yes, in my opinion, they do matter. You can get, if your only focus is trying to build a physique or get lean, then you could get away with eating a lot of crap in your diet. But if you're concerned with your overall health and wellness and long-term health, then you really want to take your food sources into consideration. So I'll cover carbs, proteins, and fats, but let's start with protein. So the protein you eat in your diet can be broken down further into a variety of types of amino acids. Some of these are essential, some of them are non-essential. I'm not going to get into all that, but just know that if you're vegetarian or vegan, it's a lot harder to get complete amino acid profile from one specific food. You have to be really careful with your intake. But for the normal person who does eat meat, I'm assuming that's most of you, you don't have an issue with that, because pretty much all animal-based products have a complete amino acid profile. So you want to focus the majority of your protein intake to come from animal-based products. So things like meats, fish, dairy, cheese, whey protein, casein protein. I would just say try to get the majority of your intake from whole foods and try to limit your intake of supplemental protein. You don't want powders and bars to make up the majority of your protein intake. So protein intake's pretty simple. Just focus on whole foods. After protein intake, you want to start looking at your carbohydrate intake. So after you've established how many grams of carbs you're going to eat per day, you want to start looking at where those carbs are coming from. Along with protein, your carb sources aren't necessarily a huge issue. I would just say, as a general rule, focus on less processed things like whole grains, oatmeal, potatoes. Starchy vegetables are great. You don't have to eat whole grains, you don't have to eat whole wheat, but that will help you meet your fiber intake. If you're not meeting your fiber intake, just eat more vegetables. And a large bulk of your carbohydrate intake should come from vegetables, at least volume-wise, not necessarily in terms of grams, because there's not a lot of grams of carbohydrates in vegetables. For each meal, you should be trying to consume a larger portion of vegetables or fruits. They're high in fiber and micronutrients, so vitamins, minerals, all those things your body really needs. You're gonna get those through eating your fruits and vegetables. So don't neglect that. Make sure you're eating plenty of fiber, and just try to keep your sugar intake relatively low. If you have a day or two where your sugar intake's really high, it's not a big deal, not something to stress about. But for the majority of the time when setting up your diet, just try to keep processed sugar, any type of processed foods that's high in sugar, try to keep that relatively low. Sugar from fruits and vegetables and other things are kind of a different story, but I'll get more into sugar intake in a future video. Just for carbs, focus on whole foods, just like protein. Whole grains are great. There's nothing wrong with things like white rice, etc. Don't worry about the glycemic index. I know it's been getting a lot of attention, but Well, I'll explain more on that in my future video when I talk about sugar intake, but that's really not a big issue. There's nothing worse about white rice than brown rice. Actually, if you have issues digesting brown rice, white rice is a great option because it's a lot easier to digest, especially when your carb intake is really high. But yeah, that's about it for carbs. So the thing I really want to focus on is fat intake, and it's probably not what you're used to hearing, the advice I'm going to give, but here it goes. Pretty much, when it comes to fats, you want to focus on, just like I said with carbs and proteins, whole food sources, but you really want to avoid processed fats. This is because fats that are processed get degraded and are really high in omega-6s, which can cause inflammation, and have been linked to a ton of health issues. You can do your own research on this. I'm not going to get into that, but just know that you don't want a really high omega-6 intake. That's one of the major health issues, especially with a typical Western diet in America right now, is an omega-6 intake that is way too high. So things that are high in omega-6s are processed or hydrogenated oils. Usually you read a label and almost any of the oils that are used in it are going to be processed oils. So opting for, if you're going to eat processed foods, try not to eat things that are really high in fat, because these are going to be loaded with vegetable oils, canola oil, hydrogenated oils, partially hydrogenated oils. Those are the oils that are really unhealthy, and they actually can cause health issues. Whereas things like saturated fats, they've said forever that saturated fats are bad, and that's what's causing heart disease, everything. They've actually taken back those statements. Even the government is now saying that saturated fat isn't that bad for you. Saturated fats are not bad. Dietary cholesterol, so things like whole eggs, they're not bad. Egg yolks are actually an awesome fat source. Ton of nutrients. There's nothing wrong with fatty meats, especially if it's grass-fed or not raised off of grains like most of the meat is now. So I'll kind of give a list of quality fat sources. Things like avocados, nuts and seeds, fattier meats, dairy. If you tolerate dairy well, dairy can be a great fat source. Things like cheese, grass-fed butter is a great dense fat source. Nut butters are awesome and delicious. Try to eat some fatty fish because it's really high in omega-3s. Also, grass-fed meat and pasture-raised eggs are also really high in omega-3s. If you don't already know all the benefits of omega-3s, you can do your own research on that. There's a ton of information out there. I'm not going to get into that. When it comes to using oils, let's say for salad dressings or cooking, you just don't want to use processed oils. So things like extra virgin olive oil is great for salad dressings. And then for cooking, things like coconut oil, avocado oil, macadamia nut oil, grass-fed butter, those are all great for cooking and can handle higher temperatures where olive oil can't. That's kind of a basic breakdown of quality fat sources. Just avoid processed foods that have really high fat, or things like sunflower oil, canola oil, soybean oil, all those other vegetable oils. Just vegetable oils in general aren't a good option because they have to be extremely processed. Corn oil, think about that. Is there a lot of fat in corn? No. It has to go through a really significant, intensive processing to get any significant amount of fat out of corn. Things like that are highly processed and they're going to be really high in omega-6s, so just try to avoid that. Consuming some of that, is that going to be bad? Definitely not. You just don't want the majority of your fat intake to come from that. So in summary, just focus on whole unprocessed foods as much as you can. That's usually going to provide the most nutrients in your diet and help optimize your overall health, and you'll thank yourself in the long term for that. So I'll get more into things like if it fits your macros, sugar intake and fiber, and how those correlate in future videos. But this is kind of the basic coverage of the sources for your macronutrients. So hope you guys are liking the content, and I'll keep the videos coming. Catch you next time.